Do not say, why were the former days better than these? For you do not inquire wisely concerning this. Hello, welcome back to Bethel Evangelical Free Church Hanley on YouTube. I'm Pastor Charmley, and in this video I want to present the other side to the last video I did. The last video was on why should Christians be interested in the study of history. In this one, I'm not going to say why we shouldn't, because that would be a contradiction, but rather what the dangers that can accompany a wrong study of history are. Solomon in Ecclesiastes 7:10, the passage that I read at the beginning of this video, points out the danger of saying, why were the former days better than these? And that stands in many ways for the whole many different number of ways in which the study of history can go wrong. And the primary error in the study of history is that we view the past not as that which we learn from, as that which we stand upon, but as that which we want to go back to. It's the danger of nostalgia, the danger of saying the past was better, let's go back there. The scriptures nowhere encourage such an attitude. They encourage us indeed to look back to the past to see the blessings of former days, and to pray that we may know the blessings of former days in the present, but not to go back to the past to try to recover the former days. There is indeed a continuity in the work of the church, in the life of the church, but it is, as it's presented in the scriptures, it is a dynamic continuity. It's not a static continuity. One of the dangers that was confronted and that was fallen into by folk like Mr. Pusey, got his biography up here, in the Oxford movement, in the early decades, the middle decades really, of the 19th century, was that Britain was changing. The United Kingdom was going from being this nation, England was changing, England and Ireland, and Parliament was changing. With the Oxford movement, when it started, there was this feeling Parliament had gone from being the Church of England represented to being something that included nonconformists, and even people who were Jewish, weren't even Christians. And the concern was to go back. And so you see in church architecture in the 19th century this attempt to go back to the Gothic. And you find these incredibly pedantic articles that are written, oh, we have to go back, and this is what the Gothic churches should look like. And now it is best the Gothic revival doesn't just say, well, this is what a medieval church looked like, we need to look like a medieval church. But at its worst, that's precisely what it does. And so you find church buildings that are constructed in the 19th century that are constructed to try to look as much as possible as though they were built in the 14th century. So a desire to go back. You find, and again in the Oxford movement, I'm not just picking on the Oxford movement because it's something to pick on, but because I've done some study of it. And one of the things you find is this idea where we have to go back in terms of how we dress, how the clergy dress, go back to the past. And it becomes a very antiquarian thing for many people. There's an organisation, it's not so much the Oxford movement now, it's the Cambridge movement. There's an organisation that is founded, a group in Cambridge, that's called the Cambridge Camden Society initially, and then the Ecclesiological Society. And it's not the history of it's not the study, rather, of the doctrine of the church. Ecclesiology should be the study of the doctrine of the church, but for them it's the study of how should church buildings be built. Rather than saying, well, what are the needs of the congregation? They say, well, what did these things look like in the Middle Ages? And you find them talking about the medieval period as the ages of faith. And we have to try to recover that. Now, there are many good things that can be said about the zeal many of these people had for reaching the poor with the gospel and helping the poor. But this oh, we have to go back. And we find the same thing happens more recently in nonconformist and free church circles, and with a recovery of Reformed doctrine. Now, Reformed doctrine is a wonderful thing. I'm a Calvinist, to use the popular language, and I regard it as biblical teaching. The danger comes when people discover the Puritans, for example, and the Puritans have so much to teach us about very many things. But it's very easy to take those great big Puritan works, and instead of learning from them and trying then to speak to the people of our day in the language of our day, then what happens instead is that people take these and they start sounding like Puritans and writing like Puritans, and sometimes, even worse, preaching very, very, very long sermons like the Puritans. Now, you could do that in the 17th century because that's what people were used to. And great if you're capable of preaching a 50-minute sermon and the people are willing to bear a 50-minute sermon, but very often people aren't. And so you get this idea that really you try to take things back to the past. Now, there is an equal and opposite error, which is that of rejecting the past, which is that of going in, of saying, well, we can't learn anything from the past. No, the whole point is we learn from the past, but we learn from the past and we speak to the present. We cannot live in the past, and this is another part of that great error of nostalgia. We try to live in the past, and whether that's the 17th century, or the 18th century, or the 19th century, or the 20th century, we can't live in the past, we live in the present. And so the great danger that can come is that nostalgia that says, well, let's go back to the past. Another way that this manifests itself is that people try to look at the contemporary scene and act as though it were the past. We see that quite often in terms of language, for example. Whenever I hear somebody use the word Anabaptist, and they're not referring to the Mennonites, that sort of group, the people who genuinely do look back to those continental Anabaptists, but they're talking about modern day Baptists, but they're calling them Anabaptists. I ask the question, why? And very often it's, well, these people have rediscovered a Reformation theology, whether it's the Reformed theology or Lutheranism, and they want to talk like the past. Now, there was this tendency in the later Byzantine period, the Eastern Roman Empire, when people wrote history, they tried to write using the categories of the past. And that meant that if there was a war on, it had to be a war with one of the ancient enemies. So wars with the Arabs became wars with the Persians in the histories. Why? Because these historians, these chroniclers, were imitating the style of the past. There were no wars with Arabs in the past, so therefore it must be the Persians. And again, it's this artificial language, trying to speak like the past. And it's a temptation that comes very often with those who have studied the history in a very, very narrow way. And this then leads to a different error, which is that of looking at the past, looking at history in a purely sectarian way, to such an extent that people create false histories. The obvious example of that, and one I bring up often, is what's called Baptist successionism. Now, Baptist successionism is this idea that the Baptists aren't Protestants because Baptists trace their ancestry all the way back to John the Baptist. I mean, he's called John the Baptist, isn't he? And and they then trace this to all these groups in the past. But you actually do proper historical study, you go, but this doesn't make any sense. Some of these groups we know next to nothing about them. Some of the groups we do know something about them, and all that we know about them is that they were heretics who deny the Trinity. Others, for example, the Waldenses, they're very often claimed. But the Waldenses today, and in the Reformation era, they baptized infants. But you actually look at the genuine history of the English Baptist movement, it comes out of Elizabethan separatism, the same roots as Congregationalism. And this is the creation of false histories. that say that our group, we are the, no doubt, but we are the people and wisdom shall die with us. Real history is complicated. And a shallow, sectarian, false history can be very, very damaging, because it encourages not the humility that the study of true history does, but an arrogance that says, we are the people, and wisdom shall die with us. No, we are not the people. History is complicated. Our history is complicated. Everybody in history has their warts, has their blemishes. And this leads me to another problem in the study of history, is that you have people who will read history in a very, and some of this is sectarian as well, in a very narrow way, a very shallow way rather. And so you come across, for example, and this is the example that's always brought up, John Calvin supported the execution of Miguel Servetus as a heretic. He did. And people then jump up and down and scream, oh, how awful Calvin was. Or Martin Luther said some really nasty things about the Jews. He did. And we shouldn't cover these things up, because if you do, then you end up giving the impression that these people were different from the way they really were. However, if you look at these people in isolation from history, then you look at them and you go, well, these were awful things to do. Well, they were. But they were things that anybody else, practically, living in the same time, in the same place, would have done. Calvin wasn't being revolutionary by talking about how heretics needed to be punished by the magistrates. He was being the opposite of revolutionary. Because everybody in those days in medieval Europe and early modern Europe thought, well, pretty much everybody, thought that heresy wasn't just an offence against the church, it was a crime against the state. It was soul murder. The heretic was a criminal. That was the way they thought. So it's where Calvin's being the opposite of revolutionary. He's being very, very conservative in that attitude. Martin Luther in that attitude towards the Jews. Early on in his ministry, Luther's actually very amazingly conciliatory to the Jews, because he lived in an atmosphere where hating the Jews was normal. And then later on, because and it seems very much it's because the Jews didn't convert the way he thought they would, now that he was preaching the true gospel, he becomes annoyed with them and writes this bad-tempered rant against them. But again, it's not that he's this man who single-handedly creates German anti-Semitism. No, he's a German in a culture that has a lot of anti-Semitism in it. And if you look at history in this very shallow way, you see these people having these awful opinions, and it's very easy to go, oh, these people were specifically awful, especially awful for having these opinions, when in fact, no, these people lived in a culture where this sort of opinion was normal. Now that doesn't mean that they're not in some way to be blamed for agreeing with the culture, but that is they're agreeing with the culture. They're not saying something that is new, revolutionary, and awful. It is in fact surprising that Calvin and Luther are so often condemned precisely for those points in which they did not depart from the culture in which they lived, rather than for points in which they did. But rather we ask, we see their blind spots, but we don't say, oh, they had these blind spots, therefore we can learn nothing from them. We say, they had blind spots. I've got blind spots. What are my blind spots? What are the things in my culture that I live in that I'm in danger of being blind to, or that I am blind to? What are the cultural attitudes and prejudices that I have that are contrary to the Word of God? And that's how we learn from history. So I want a positive conclusion. We learn from history so that we may live better in the present, and so that we may deal with the world in which we live. Well, thank you for watching, and may God bless you and help us all to be salt and light in our present age. Thank you for watching. May God bless you. Amen.